What are economies of scale? This mini lesson briefly explains and looks at some of their advantages. Economies of scale is a term used to describe certain benefits that a business gains from increasing levels of production. Term used to describe certain benefits that a business gains from increasing levels of production. These include what are known as technical, specialization, and purchasing economies. The idea of economies of scale is about more than the simple idea that higher sales leads to higher profits. It's about changing the level of output so that certain cost savings or economies can be made. Take an extreme example. Supposing that you decide to set up your own company producing smartphones in your garage. Would you be able to compete with existing manufacturers such as Apple and Samsung? Could you make a profit from selling your phones at the same price as those made by these giant companies? You'd almost certainly find that the unit cost of production, marketing budget, and expertise of Apple and Samsung would make it very difficult to get consumers interested in buying your products. Let's quickly look at what we mean by technical specialization and purchasing economies of scale. First of all, technical economies. Larger firms can make savings through investing in bigger and more cost-effective machinery and equipment. For example, sophisticated IT systems to collate and process data can be a way to improve efficiency. However, this technology is probably only affordable to businesses operating on a certain scale. Mass production techniques involving high levels of automation can improve labor productivity, for example, the use of robots in manufacturing. Once again, though, only businesses that have reached a certain size will be able to justify purchasing this type of expensive machinery. Better and bigger transport methods can reduce distribution costs per unit, so a larger business with bigger sales might make deliveries with a lorry instead of a van. This will produce cost savings. It will reduce the number of trips needed and the amount of labour needed to deliver goods. Specialization economies. As a firm becomes larger, it's more able to obtain the advantage of division of labour. This means that a worker can concentrate on one kind of job instead of having to do a range of quite different jobs. This allows the worker to become more skilled and quicker at that specific task. This in turn will reduce labour cost per unit produced. For example, consider Joe, a small independent retailer who owns one shop. As well as dealing with customers, Joe spends time on a wide range of other tasks. These include negotiating with suppliers, arranging delivery, promoting the business, and keeping financial records. If the business could grow and operate, say, 4 or 5 shops, then Joe might be able to justify employing an accounts clerk. This is something that the profits from one shop probably could not support. But the clerk could maintain financial records, arrange for the payment of suppliers and staff, and so on. An accounts clerk will be more efficient than Joe when it comes to doing this work. This is because she does it all the time, whereas the small-scale entrepreneur like Joe only does it some of the time. A clerk also has a more detailed understanding of how to set up the right kind of financial records. The same principles apply to employing other specialists, such as marketing managers and production engineers. Purchasing economies. Large firms can buy raw materials and other inputs in greater bulk. Suppliers will be keen to offer price discounts to those businesses that they see as big customers. Not only that, the managers of a business that has been around for a time will manage costs better. The managers have learnt from experience. What are the advantages of economies of scale? Firstly, lower unit costs. Achieving economies of scale is important because this enables a business to reduce its unit costs. This gives the business two options. It can offer customers a reduced price, or it could keep prices the same and accept a better profit margin. Secondly, barriers to entry. What are barriers to entry? Very large businesses are able to deter other businesses from entering the market in the short run. As discussed earlier, it's difficult for a startup to directly compete in mass markets with businesses such as Kellogg's, breakfast cereals, Microsoft, computer operating systems, and Johnson & Johnson, pharmaceuticals, because of their sheer scale. For instance, where threats to the dominance of large companies like this emerge, a price war may break out. A large company is more likely to win a price war than a small business with much less capital and much higher unit costs. So, to sum up, economies of scale are the cost advantages that businesses obtain as they increase their size. Examples of economies of scale include technical, specialization, and purchasing. The advantages of economies of scale include lower unit costs and barriers to entry. You might like to try this question. A Limited manufactures dry dog food. The business has grown rapidly and the directors are now seeking to build a new, much bigger factory. Briefly explain how A Limited might obtain purchasing, technical and specialization economies.
Okay, hi there, and welcome to this short video looking at the difference between internal and external economies of scale. And it's an important distinction to make when analysing firms and industries and the impact of their production decisions on consumers and other stakeholders. So, what are internal economies of scale? Well, internal economies of scale are defined as the unit cost advantages, the fall in average cost per unit that comes from a business expanding the scale of their production in the long run. And this represents an improvement in their productive efficiency and can often give a business a sizable cost and competitive advantage against rival firms. You can draw an analysis diagram, for example, to show how economies of scale can lead to a fall in prices for consumers and also an increase in profits. As long as the average cost of production is falling in the long run, then internal economies of scale are being achieved. Now, a key example is that economies of scale apply to a single firm as it grows. We're focusing on a particular business as they, if you like, they ramp up the scale of production. For the exam, you'll need to have good examples of possible internal economies of scale. Some of them relate to production. For example, containerization is a great example. The idea that you can fill a ubiquitous container which has a standard width and height and length. If you can fill it, you can reduce the unit cost of transportation. Businesses might grow and employ specialist managers or be able to buy their raw materials, for example, in bulk. Larger businesses may be able to borrow money at cheaper rates of interest. That's a financial economy of scale. And also benefit from diversification, both of product and market, to cut the risk of supply. There's also something called a network economy of scale, which is where once you've built a network as a kind of platform, the marginal cost of adding an extra user is really low, and it brings down the fixed cost per user on the network. So the key revision point for an internal economy of scale is that the shape of the average cost curve in the long run depends on both the returns to scale of production. So for example, Q1 to Q2 we're seeing increasing returns to scale, and again from Q2 to Q3 the average cost is falling. The returns to scale in terms of lower costs are increasing, but also the effect of scale on the prices that a firm pays for its key inputs. So for example, as you move from Q1 to Q2 to Q3, it may well be the case that a firm can use its monopoly power to bring down the unit cost of the raw materials or the component parts that it buys. Q3 would be something close to the minimum efficient scale. Of course, there is always the potential, if the firm goes beyond its optimum size, for diseconomies of scale to kick in. But that's the subject of another video. Another key example: the extent of internal scale economies will vary from industry to industry. Here's a good example of a business that is, of course, now on a giant scale. For some people, Amazon is too big, and the issues in competition policy about whether these big businesses should be broken up. But have a look on the left-hand side, the number of people employed by Amazon, from 17,000 in 2007 to over 600,000 in 2018. This is global employment in Amazon. And look, for example, at their huge scale in terms of the Amazon Web Service providers. This is a cloud platform service. Lots of businesses, for example, including Ch7, run their websites on Amazon Web Service. And they've now got something like a huge market share compared, for example, to Microsoft Azure and the Google Cloud. So Amazon is clearly a business on an enormous scale. Another key example: in an industry where the minimum efficient scale, in other words the lowest point on the average cost curve, where that is high relative to market demand, then an industry will tend to be highly concentrated. So if there are big, significant, enormous economies of scale internally, typically the industry tends to morph towards being highly concentrated. Let's go back to our example of Amazon. Here's some data showing the smart speaker market share in the UK in 2018. Google, of course, making a big play for the smart speaker market share, but of course Amazon currently has a big advantage. Alexa, tell me the size of Amazon's market share. 75% market share in the first quarter of 2018. So that's internal economies of scale. Let's move on to external economies of scale. Well, what are they? Well, these are the reductions in average costs for businesses who benefit from an expansion of the industry of which they are a member. Key point here is that external economies of scale occur outside of a firm, but within an industry, within a sector. Classic example: an industry, all the firms in an industry might benefit from improvements in transportation networks, investment in new road and light rail, for example. Another good example could be that within a town or a city, a local university increases their investment in research and development facilities, and those are made available in partnership with local businesses. And a very good example of external economies of scale are so-called agglomeration economies that come from the clustering of similar businesses in a tight geographical location. Software businesses in Silicon Valley is a common example. An exam point for you: all firms potentially can benefit from external economies of scale, pretty much independent of their size. And let's just focus for a little bit on agglomeration economies, the cost savings, the higher efficiency, productivity that can flow from the clustering of factor inputs. So, for example, software engineers in a particular area sharing information, innovating. So the Mercedes F1 factory in Brackley is a really good example. There's a cluster of Formula One teams in and around Northamptonshire. Most of the F1 teams, actually, I think, are based in the UK, along with their research and development operations. And there's a whole network of industries, component suppliers, engineering design firms, etc., that have relocated to serve the Formula One teams in the UK. So F1, great example of external economies of scale. Silicon Valley, two lovely pictures here. There's Cupertino in California, United States, so that's the new Apple head office. Or is it the new Ch7 research and development building? I'll find out later. And the lovely view of Silicon Valley from Mission Hill. The clustering of highly talented people and businesses creates an agglomeration economy. Now, what about a diagram? Well, with an external economy of scale, that has the potential to bring down the unit cost for all firms, independent of output. So one way you would show external economies of scale is by a downward shift in the long run average cost curve. Okay, so just a quick reminder, remember internal economies of scale happen as the firm increases its output or physical size. External economies of scale occur due to external factors brought on by the expanding industry or market, transport links, research and development to support the growing industries. That's the key distinction to make. Hopefully you get a great chance to use this knowledge and this analysis in your exams.
We've already looked at a number of theories which implicitly make predictions about which countries should trade the most. So comparative advantage says the trade ought to occur most between countries which have different levels of productivity. The Ch7 theory says that trade ought to occur the most between countries with different factor shares. So both of these theories imply that countries should trade the most with countries from which they are the most different. However, a large fraction of trade actually occurs between countries which are quite similar in productivity and in factor shares. For example, there's a huge amount of trade between US and Canada. And more generally, there's a lot of trade between the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, the developed economies. Now, this doesn't mean that comparative advantage and Ch7 theory are wrong, but it does certainly mean that they're incomplete. And we want to look at some other theories which may help us to explain some of the facts about trade. In particular, we're going to be focusing on economies of scale, which come in two types. First, external economies of scale. These are at the industry level, and I'll explain this more as I go along. And then second, internal economies of scale at the firm level. It turns out that the second is more difficult to analyze analytically, because it requires us to understand monopolistic competition. We can't have straightforward competition with internal economies of scale at the firm level. So we'll talk more about that in a future lecture. Today we're going to focus on external economies of scale. Let's take a look. An important fact about many industries is they're not spread randomly around a country or around the world. Take carpet, for example. For over 100 years, the city of Dalton has been known as the carpet capital of the world. Over 100 firms produce carpet in Dalton, Georgia, and they combined produce over 70% of the world's entire production of tufted carpet. Now, not all industries cluster, so which ones cluster and why did they cluster? Why did Dalton, Georgia become the carpet capital of the world? Industrial clusters are very common. There's a small town in China with a population of just 36,000 that makes over 3 billion toothbrushes a year. Hangzhou, China produces 80% of China's toothbrush production. There are over 990 manufacturers in the Hangzhou cluster, and toothbrushes have been made there since 1827. That's another interesting fact about these clusters. Once they start, they tend to remain in place for a long time. They're very stable. Here's another cluster with which you're very familiar, Hollywood. Why is it that so many movies, not just in the United States, but for the world, are made in Hollywood? And if they're not made in Hollywood, they're probably made in another industrial cluster, Bollywood, in India. In order to understand why some industries cluster, it's useful to think about how a cluster evolves. And these principles have repeated themselves over and over again in many different types of industries. So typically, first one firm enters, and it might enter at a particular location due, let's say, to some geographic factors which lower its costs modestly in that location. So for example, California is good for filming all year round, so it made some sense for an early movie studio to begin in California. It doesn't have to have, the first entrant doesn't have to have cost advantages, however. Dalton, Georgia got its start when a young girl handcrafted a bedspread, which proved particularly popular. She got her friends making similar bedspreads, and this gave rise to an entire industry. Now think about a second firm. It looks around and asks where should it locate. And it notices that by locating near the first firm, it can take advantage of some specialized labor, of suppliers, of shippers, of some ready-made infrastructure. So the second firm enters at the same location. The third firm finds cost advantages of locating near the first two even greater. And so a cluster begins to develop until pretty soon this one spot happens to be the lowest cost place to producing that particular type of good. Let's think about Hollywood, for example. In order to make a movie, you need very quickly to assemble a large team of specialized, talented labor. If you're making a movie in Dubuque, Iowa, and your cameraman gets sick and heaven forbids dies, it's going to be really hard to find another cameraman. If you're making the same movie in the LA area, you can have another cameraman there in hours. And suppliers. If you need in your movie, suddenly you need a rewrite and you need to have an alien costume and a Roman temple, you can have all of those goods delivered to you. There are prop shops built, large prop shops, which service the entire industry. So at low cost, you can find things that you want very quickly. The same thing is true for carpets, which are created through specialized machinery, which requires informed, educated labor. So it's no surprise that the community colleges in Dalton, Georgia, also specialize in teaching people the skills used to make carpets. Even producing toothbrushes can require a lot of specialized machinery, and it helps for a firm to be located in the Hangzhou area because it can easily find the labor and the expertise that it needs in order to build toothbrushes. So this is how an industry evolves to become a cluster, and when it is clustered, it becomes the lowest cost place to produce these particular types of goods. Clusters can also help to create new innovations and inventions and improvements which lower the cost curve even further at any different quantity. So the great economist Alfred Marshall said, "Great are the advantages which people following the same skilled trade get from near neighborhood. The mysteries of the trade become no mysteries, but are as it were in the air, and children learn many of them unconsciously." This is definitely the case in Dalton, Georgia, and in Hangzhou, China. Good work is rightly appreciated. Inventions and improvements in machinery, in processes, and the general organization of the business have their merits promptly discussed. If one man starts a new idea, it is taken up by others and combined with suggestions of their own, and thus it becomes the source of further new ideas. So again, once a cluster becomes established, the costs fall quickly in that cluster, first in that cluster. They fall there before they fall anywhere else. And again, this is the reason why a firm wants to be located in a cluster with other similar firms. External economies of scale imply that as the industry gets larger, the costs of each firm in that industry begin to fall. And this means that the supply curve for the industry can actually be downward sloping, at least over a part of its range. So the supply or industry average cost curve, in contrast to the usual supply curve, which is upward sloping, can actually slope downwards, particularly as the cluster is being established. So when Dalton, Georgia is small, the carpet industry has high costs. But as the industry in Dalton grows larger, the costs to each firm in that industry begin to fall. Notice that what this means is that when an industry is large, it's going to be very difficult to start an industry anywhere else because the costs to production are lowest in Dalton, Georgia, where it already has economies of scale, where the economies of scale have already been built up. Let's now see what implications there are for trade when we have external economies of scale. So let's suppose that there are two industries, toothbrushes and carpets, two countries, the United States and China, or Canada if you like, it doesn't matter which. And let's suppose that we have no trade. So in the initial equilibrium, let's suppose that the US demand is in blue and the Chinese demand, we'll say, is in green. Same thing over here, US demand for carpets is in blue, Chinese demand for carpets is in green. So the demand is the size of the market in these two countries. Given the size of the market, given the demand in the United States, the price of toothbrushes in the United States will be here, and the quantity of toothbrushes sold will be here. Same thing for carpets. The price of U.S. carpets is given here and the quantity here. China has got a, let's say, slightly bigger market than the U.S. market. So because of economies of scale, it has a lower price of toothbrushes and a bigger quantity. And same here, a lower price of carpets and a bigger quantity. We could mix and match these however we want. It doesn't really matter. Now here's the point. Suppose that we now introduce trade. Well, what will happen? Well, one thing which could happen is that these industries cluster in just such a way that we get more of both goods. So for example, let's look at the total world demand for toothbrushes, which is simply just the US demand plus the Chinese demand. So this is the total world demand for toothbrushes. This is the total world demand for carpet. Again, just the US demand plus the Chinese demand. Now, if now we have a cluster such that all the toothbrushes are made in China and all the carpets are made in the United States, then the cost of producing toothbrushes falls, the cost of producing carpets falls, so now China produces a lot more toothbrushes, their quantity of production increases. The United States produces a lot more carpet, but because the cost of both of these goods has fallen due to taking advantage of these external economies of scale, China and the United States can trade carpet for toothbrushes, and both countries can be better off. So by taking advantage of larger markets allow you to extract everything possible from these external economies of scale. By building the toothbrush industry bigger in one location and building the carpet industry in Dalton, Georgia, by making that larger, we can take advantage of all the possible external economies of scale, push our costs down to the minimum level, and then trade. And since costs for both products have gone down, both countries will be better off. Let's look at two interesting effects in the presence of external economies of scale. First, I'm going to call this the big get bigger effect. Let's take a look. Suppose there are two countries. We're going to call them big and small. The big country is not necessarily big in size, but it has a big market for this particular product. So here's the demand curve for big, here's the one for small. Also, we're going to suppose that the average cost curve or the supply curve in the big market does not fall as far as in the small market. In other words, at any particular quantity, the costs of producing that quantity of good are lower in the small market than they are in the big market. However, the big market starts off big. So the big market starts off with a cost advantage due to the fact that it can take advantage of these economies of scale. So now notice what happens if we now introduce free trade. Well, if we have free trade and here's our world demand curve, we may end up at what I call the historical equilibrium. That is, something plausible which happens is that the big market gets bigger. Because it begins with the cost advantage, it's able to outcompete the suppliers in the small market so that we end up with the big market taking the dominant share, taking the world market. That historical equilibrium is opposed to the ideal equilibrium. If everything was ideal, the location of the cluster would be in the small market because that's where you reduce costs the most. But because the small market starts off small, it ends up even smaller. The big get bigger, the small get smaller. So in theory, what this means is that we don't always end up at the ideal equilibrium. This is a little bit sad, probably not too much to worry about, because what we really want to do is make sure that we take advantage of the trade to take advantage of these economies of scale. But it does mean that we don't necessarily get to the ideal equilibrium. The chains of history bind us so that we may end up at the historical equilibrium. The second effect, the there can only be one effect, is closely related. There can only be one Dalton, Georgia. There can only be one Seattle, Washington, or Silicon Valley, or Hollywood. I mean, literally, this is not true, but there certainly aren't going to be many. Some people argue that in order to be the one, we should have strategic trade policy. That is, there are some benefits to being Dalton, Georgia, or to being Seattle, Washington, or Silicon Valley. And if we could, we would like to be the ones who eat up those benefits. So what these people suggest is that we ought to, for example, protect our industries. We ought to throw up tariffs and barriers to trade so that our small industries become big. We allow them to grow until they get the cost advantages of economies of scale, and only then do we open them up to world trade. And because we only open up to world trade once our industries have got these economies of scale, we're then able to dominate the world and take over these industries. We may end up at the historical equilibrium, or if we're lucky, we may end up at the ideal equilibrium if we happen to start off small and then we grew our industry. But either way, the point of strategic trade policy is that we end up being the one. Now again, this idea works in theory. In practice, it can be a little bit dangerous. If every country tries to be the one, then every country may end up trying to protect its industries, trying to grow its industries behind these tariff walls, and we may never get the advantages of the economies of scale which free trade can produce. So for the world as a whole, it's probably more important that industries cluster around the world and we take advantage of clustering and then trade than it is that we are the ones who end up with the cluster. It would be nice if we did, but we probably can't tip the balance that often. It's going to be very tricky to be able to tip the balance in our favor, and the times in which we are able to tip the balance probably do not justify the number of times where, because of the tariffs and the quotas, we don't get all of the economies of scale that we can get. Anyway, that's my opinion from evaluating this literature. Other people may differ, but strategic policy is something which can work in theory. One more point before we conclude. External economies of scale and dynamic economies of scale can also occur across industries. That is, the ideas in one industry can cross-pollinate or fertilize ideas in another industry, can lower costs in another industry. Having a lot of smart people together in an area where they can communicate with one another, you never know what idea is going to be particularly fruitful, be particularly profitable in a place where the first person might never have thought to apply that idea, but the second person can apply that idea. These are also called agglomeration economies or synergies. And this most fundamentally explains why we have cities. After all, there are a lot of disadvantages to cities. There are congestion, it's more expensive to live in a city, costs are higher in a city, and yet people are more productive in cities. It's not just that more productive people go to live in cities, although that happens too. It's that the same people are more productive in a city. They generate more ideas when they're around other people who generate ideas. So this explains why the external economies of scale and international trade also have implications for economic geography, and it's why Paul